Now you can go.
Okay.
I don't know why I keep forgetting that.
Yeah, because the first message is not for the people who are present. For the people tuning in on GoToMeeting, please be sure that everything is muted, both the sound and the video, and use the chat box to communicate and ask questions, but please make sure you're sending your message to the organizer. And I'm very proud to introduce our speaker for today. Her name is Julie Learned, and she is an assistant professor in the Department of Education, Theory, and Practice at the University of Albany in SUNY. She studies adolescent literacy by examining how secondary schools position readers and writers and how young people experience, resist, and help construct school contexts. She investigates issues of equity in literacy education. Her work has appeared in several journals, including the American Educational Research Journal, Education and Urban Society, Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy, and Reading Research Quarterly. She won the International Literacy Association Outstanding Dissertation of the Year Award for 2016. And in fall 2017, she received a grant from the Spencer Foundation to continue studying youth readers across the context of high school. And her title of her presentation is Literacies and Contexts, Studying Youth Readers Across School Spaces and Times. Turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really happy to be here.
Say hi to the webinar.
Hi to everyone on the webinar. Glad to have you too.
And there you go.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, as Rosemary said, I'm at the University at Albany, and I am in my 4th year there as an assistant professor. My research in adolescent literacy has to do at its core with literacies and contexts, and the extent to which contexts mediate our literate practices and our skills and our literate identities. And the questions I research now are the same ones that came to me when I was a high school teacher. I was a high school reading teacher and a high school special education teacher before I did my PhD. And I was in a school that had a co-teaching model. So I was in with science teachers and in with math teachers and in English classes as the person to support reading and literacy. And I would see then the same high school students in many different content area classes. And in a typically organized high school, adults only see kids like one time in English or one time in science. So I saw them like across the day. And I saw this really interesting variability in who they were as students and who they were as readers, like their reading motivation, their ability to deal with complex texts. It varied depending on a lot of different factors. And I was curious about that because it seemed when I was teaching that it was more complicated than just, oh, you know, she has a really good relationship with that teacher, or oh, she really likes science, so she can read and understand science. It was like multiple factors that were interacting. So I went to do my PhD at the University of Michigan, and I learned a bunch of like scholarly language to like ask the questions that had occurred to me when I was teaching. But as I look back now, they're still the kind of core questions that drive my work. So today I'll be talking about literacies and contexts, and I'll talk about a few of my studies, all of my studies, because I'm at the beginning of my, oh, let's see, this isn't advancing. Let me try the keyboard.
Just click anywhere on the PowerPoint.
Okay. Okay. Yep, there we go. So I keep studying literacies and contexts from different vantage points. And all of my work has been in urban schools that were pretty under-resourced, and that's also the kind of school that I taught in. All the schools that I've studied have been really diverse socioeconomically and racially and ethnically. And I've looked at readers with different kinds of labels and followed them across different content area classes. So in my first study in 2012-2013, I looked at young people who are identified as struggling readers, because that was kind of what brought me in to the field. And I followed them across their reading and their math and their history classes. And I'm going to talk about that study today because it's really the generative foundation for my work. And I found, as I had kind of seen when I was teaching, that there was a lot of variability in their literacy skills and their identities and who they showed up as students in different classes. And the point of that study was to document like what school contexts appear to really matter, what changes things for a student. So they show up and they come to school and they don't get sent to suspension. I mean, these were kinds of the practical things that were happening for the youth in my study who were identified as struggling readers. Then did a second study in 2015 where I looked at reading and tracked English language arts contexts. And in this study, I was interested to see what counted as reading proficiency and reading struggle in differently tracked English classes. So for example, in like the remedial English class, is reading proficiency the same thing as it is in the AP English class? And I found in that study, the big finding was that, in fact, it was highly contextualized. And this was in an urban school that had adopted the Common Core state standards, and it was in a state of oversight with the state, so in a state of receivership. And it was a very highly regulated school. There's a common curriculum in English. There were supposed to be common goals among teachers. And in my study, with the kind of theoretical lens of context, I was looking at, with all of this regulation and all of this commonality and all these shared goals, why is reading proficiency and struggle kind of understood so differently across these tracked contexts? And those two studies have led me to my third study. So this is what I'm currently doing, and I'll end briefly by telling you about it. I'm in the middle of data collection, so I don't have findings yet. But I am shadowing readers with different labels. So I've got struggling readers, kids who are labeled as proficient, kids who are labeled as advanced, and I'm following them across the content area classes. So this kind of builds off my first and second studies by looking at differently labeled readers and then looking beyond English, looking across content areas. And I'm having a really great time doing that. So I'm here because they're on February break. So I said I can come to Rutgers when they're going to be gone. So today I said I'm going to talk about that first study. And this was the one of youths who were identified as struggling readers. And so the research gap that I identified to begin the study was that adolescent literacy research had found that reading contexts matter for youth readers, particularly out-of-school studies. So for a lot of struggling readers, a lot of the work had looked at who are they in their community spaces, and then documented all their sophisticated literacy knowledge and practices. But there hadn't been a lot of study of these same youths who were identified as struggling readers in school contexts. So I wanted to look at who were they across their school day. And literacy research historically has been, I mean, quasi-experimental, but then even qualitative research will tend to look at kids and teachers in one class in kind of a finite space. And so there, at the time that I did the study, there weren't a lot of shadow studies where people had been following kids across the day. And as I said in my introduction, a high school student navigates so many different disciplinary domains, so many different social groups, student-teacher relationships, the context, or the myriad context of secondary school. So I wanted to look at that. So my research questions for that study were, to what extent do youth identified as struggling readers vary in their demonstration of reading-related practices, identities, and skills in and through different school contexts? So I conceived of reading really multidimensionally. I was looking at their skills, I was looking at their reading practices, and also their reading identities. And I was looking to document variation. That had been my experience as a teacher, but nobody had really documented it as a researcher, so I was looking to document it and see if it was there. And then the second one was, what school contexts appear to mediate readers' demonstration of these practices, identities, and skills? So which contexts matter? And then I triangulated perspectives. I looked at what youth identified when we would talk about this, what helps you read, what helps you want to come to class, what teachers identified as we discussed instruction and we discussed the focal participants, and then what I identified as an outside researcher coming into the building. And then after identifying what contexts seemed to matter, I looked at why and how do these contexts even matter. So these were the theoretical and empirical perspectives that grounded my study, and they continue to ground my subsequent work. I understand literacy as socially situated in cultural and social contexts, so I draw on Scribner and Cole and Street. I'm really interested in context, and so I understand context as being constructed through people's interactions across time and space and relationships. So there are some theories of context that are more place-based and kind of so there's school context and there's out-of-school context. But I really tried to lead with this idea that we create context in interaction with each other. So a context could be a moment in time, it could be half of a class period, and the contexts overlap with each other. It's a very fluid construct, but I looked at context as social environments, and that was important to the data collection and to analysis. And then I drew on literacy research that had shown, contexts matter for kids' skills, identities, and practices, and kids get positioned through contexts. I took a perspective that institutional context, so school processes, school policies, never happen to youth. So it's a tricky thing because you want to document or look at like how do school, like tracking practices, for example, support or diminish kids' outcomes. But I never wanted to study youths and conceive of them as not having agency. So I wanted to look at the ways in which they have agency, the ways in which they shape contexts, but also acknowledge that authority in school context is weighted to teachers and administrators. Kids can't make the same kinds of choices that teachers and administrators can make. So theories of power and authority were also important to my analysis, and I drew on Foucault mainly for that. And then that school context matter for struggling readers. There was a little evidence for that when I started this work, and I wanted to build on it. So the study happened in the 2012-2013 school year, and it was a whole year long in a medium-sized Midwestern city. The school was a large, comprehensive public high school with about 1,500 students. Less than half of the students tested at proficient or advanced in the state reading assessment. So the school was kind of like a lot of schools. They were eager, they had a sense of urgency about improving reading scores across the building. A little less than 60% of the kids were identified as economically disadvantaged by the district. Around 19% were identified as having disabilities, and 15% were learning English. The district reported these race and ethnicity categories for the school. So it was a little bit less than 0.5% white or Caucasian, and then a little bit more than that of students of color. And it was the biggest population would have been African American or Black students at 30%, and the Latino and Hispanic population at 13%. So it was a really diverse school, people from a lot of different backgrounds in the school. My focal participants were 8 ninth graders who were identified as struggling readers by standardized assessments and by teachers. So I was there the first week of school. They were starting high school as ninth graders, and they came in and they were identified as struggling readers, which meant they were in a reading intervention class. I also selected comparative peers. So these were 14 ninth graders who were in the same classes as the struggling readers, but teachers identified them as strong readers and good students. And then I got their standardized assessment and verified that. And that helped me. They weren't the focus, but they helped me then like contextualize the analysis, looking at to compare the two groups of kids' experiences. And then I also selected school personnel. There were 8 teachers, and these were the focal participants teachers in reading and history and math, and also the school literacy coach. We won't read this whole table, but this is the detailed look at the focal participant demographics. And you can see there were half young women and half young men. Their self-identifications, their racial and ethnic self-identifications varied a lot. The languages they spoke in their homes varied quite a bit. None of them were identified as getting English language learner services, and none of them were identified as having learning disabilities, so none of them had special education services. I'll draw your attention to the last column, and it's the end of year academic status. At the end of the year, only half of the 8 participants were still attending school and on track for so their sophomore year. 2 had been expelled and 2 had stopped attending. And part of my presentation of these findings is to think, why did half of these young people stop coming to school or get kicked out of school, and what can we do from a literacy perspective to keep kids in school and create meaningful school experiences? These are the participant groups. So my focal participants at first row, 75% of them were young people of color and 25% were white. So kids of color were overrepresented among struggling readers in my sample, which is also reflective of the struggling reader population in the school. Young people of color were over-identified. Among comparative peers, white students were overrepresented in comparison to the school demographics. All the teachers and the literacy coach were white, and nearly all the teaching staff at this high school in the Midwest was white. The other thing I point out on this table is that in the last column, I collected a lot of data, and I'll get to my data sources, but I also collected behavior data. So on average, for the focal participants, they missed about 15 days of school due to suspension or expulsion, and less than 1 day for the comparative peers. So access to school was very different among those 2 groups. So I had 7 data sources. The first was classroom observations, and I spent about 425 hours over the course of the year in reading, math, and history classes. I did a lot of different kinds of interviews. I did 48 semi-structured interviews with all the participants. I did reading process interviews where we looked at text, they thought aloud about what they were reading, and I did open-ended ethnographic interviews. I collected reading diagnostic scores that this district and the school were administering, so those are some of those. data. I did a student questionnaire that informed my interviews. I collected student records, so I had their school achievement data, their behavior and attendance records. I also collected classroom artifacts like texts, assignments, and student work, and you'll see some of that in the presentation. And I took photos of school spaces. So this was like a very deep and vast study, both in terms of time and in terms of data sources. This is what the classroom observations look like. So these are the focal participants, and this is how they clustered together in their reading and their history and their algebra class. So in high school, if any of you have taught high school, the master schedule is incredibly complex, like who goes where and when. And if you're scheduled into a reading intervention class, you probably will end up in some of your content area classes with those same students. And so I had identified these clusters, and this is how they traveled across these content areas. So I observed in 13 different class periods, and they were taught by 8 teachers. I should say I shadow observed them, so I would follow one student for like a week, like 4 days, and then move on to the next student. So I had 8 participants, and I cycled through 3 times. So I shadowed them, but because they were in the same class periods, that you can see that here, I ended up seeing them all the time. It wasn't like I only saw them like every 8 weeks. I would see every student at least once a week in one of these classes because of the way they were clustered, unless they had stopped coming to school for a period of time. I used constant comparative analysis to analyze my data. I wrote memos, I created key linkage charts to identify the constructs under study. My findings were that context mattered for these young people, and that their reading skills and identities and practices did vary. And there were institutional contexts like tracking and like being identified as a struggling reader, behavior management policies, and then there were classroom contexts like social relationships and instructional contexts. So I sorted the context into kind of these 2 domains. And I can't talk about all of them in one talk, and so today I'm going to focus on classrooms. And I'll index the institutional aspects as it makes sense. If you're interested in the institutional piece, which to me is so fascinating, there's a piece that came out in the end of 2016 in AERJ, so you could read about those findings. So today I'll focus on classrooms. I'm going to use one of my focal participants to guide the talk. Her name was Keisha. Her pseudonym was Keisha. She was representative of the patterns I saw across all 8 focal participants. So this is to give you a little meat for what do I mean by these institutional and classroom contexts. So in the first week of school, I was talking to her about her Read 180 class that she was scheduled into. And she said, Read 180 helped me in the beginning, in 6th and 7th and 8th grade, but I already know what to do. Reading is boring. It used to be so fun. I don't want to do it. So Read 180, according to a teacher in the building, was meant to be a 1-year intervention. But the district had invested a lot of money in this reading class, and they had to show the state they were providing reading instruction like kind of under the guise of response to intervention programs. And so kids would get scheduled into Read 180 for repeated years. And there was a lot of frustration about that among the students like Keisha, who said like, hey, I liked this thing in the beginning of middle school, but now I don't like it and I don't want to read. And so this was an institutional problem, because I would talk to the teachers and say, why are they still on Read 180? And they're like, well, we have to offer an evidence-based reading curriculum, and that's the one we have, and I can't go out and buy a new one. So this was a good example of an institutional context that teachers and students had to work through. And then in terms of classroom context, Keisha said to me, you know, I have the vocabulary in mind. Like I can sound out words, I can read, I can spell. I don't know why I need the extra help. I'd be feeling like I'm slow because I'm in this class. So just being scheduled into this class and the curriculum that she had experienced and walking physically into that room and being seen walking into the Read 180 room was embarrassing, and ascribed a slow learner identity. She says, I'm feeling slow. I'm slow because I'm in this class. But in the first part of that exemplar, she talks about all the ways in which she can read. So she's not taking on a struggling reader identity despite being scheduled into this program, but she is starting to feel like this class is for the slow people, so maybe I'm slow. And so I'll talk about more about classroom contexts. These are from a writing exercise in the beginning of their reading class. Keisha's is the top one, and she said, and the prompt was, how do you feel about being in Read 180? And she said, I don't think nothing about this class because I don't like it. I wasn't supposed to be in this class, and I'm not going to like it one bit. And then Janice was another focal participant, and in her writing, she says, I don't remember signing up for this class. And it's another example of institutional systems that are confusing to the students, because they, going into 9th grade, chose their classes. So then when they get their 9th grade schedule and there are classes they didn't sign up for, they're like, wait, I didn't sign up for this class. Like, why am I in this class? So I unpack the different effects some of these institutional processes seem to have, and then socially, how that played out for young people in these classes. So I shadowed Keisha across Read 180, US History with Mr. Rodman, and Algebra with Mr. Henry, and saw a lot of variation in her literacy practices and also in her social behaviors across the day. These are 2 quick examples of her work because I just want to demonstrate that she's a reader and that she knows how to read. This is from her reading journal, and she read Broken Memory, and she wrote, the character Emma reminds me of my auntie when the character was mad that her mama died. I thought her mama was not going to die, but she did. So this is like, she's making a connection with text. So for you literacy people, like, we want them to make connections with texts. She made a prediction, it wasn't right. So these are all the things we want readers to do, so she can do this. This is from her math class. It's a worksheet on writing exponents in expressions, and I'll talk about disciplinary literacy today. So at the top part, you have to translate from written English to the exponential symbols. And then in the bottom part, you have to translate from the exponents to an expression written in English. So this is key to mathematical literacy. She's decoding this stuff, she's translating across symbol systems, and she's doing it accurately in math. So she's a reader. Institutional context, I've mentioned some of them, and like I said, if you're interested, I can direct you more to this. So I'll move on to my classroom context findings. So in classrooms, there seemed to be 2 dimensions of context that mattered for focal participants. There were social dimensions and there were instructional dimensions, and those things seemed to interact with each other. So social dimensions had to do with like student-teacher interactions, the way young people were regarded by teachers, the way kids interacted with other kids, and also with classroom and community climate. The tone of a classroom climate mattered. And then of course, instructional dimensions happened. Was there literacy instruction happening in math or in history or in reading? What did it look like? And was it scaffolded? So I'll give you an example of these things using Keisha's case. My assertion and my big finding, and this is actually going to come out in Teachers College Record this year, it was that when you've identified as struggling readers experienced disciplinary literacy instruction, so not decontextualized skill instruction, not like decoding or like read this paragraph and tell me what it's about, but like really rigorous, rich disciplinary literacy instruction. And when that was embedded in trusting and caring relationships with teachers and other classroom participants, the young people kind of thrived as readers. They either showed kind of proficient or improving reading skills and practices and identities. They actually attended class. They seemed more motivated. They seemed to feel good about themselves. And those 2 things in interaction were really important. So I'll talk about the social dimensions first. So in interaction, and this comes back to my theory of context, that we create context through social environments, participants made meaning of reading identities, practices, and skills. And the tone of interactions, like were they positive? Were kids just getting reprimanded all the time? Like, what was the tone of the student and teacher interactions? It seemed related to instructional decisions. And these interactions mediated identity and behavior and positioning. So I interviewed all the teachers, and I looked across 16 interviews and I coded their responses to the question, why does so-and-so have difficulty reading and learning in math? Or why does so-and-so have difficulty reading and learning in history? And teachers had different interpretations of reading and learning difficulty. And this seemed to be related to how they interacted with students. So some teachers understood challenges more as student problems, like student deficits, like it's a problem of motivation and attitude, it's a problem of attendance or behavior. And some teachers made more context-focused interpretations, and they talked about out-of-school circumstances or social inequality, and they didn't locate the challenge inside the student, but looked for like things outside and around the student that might be creating moments of difficulty. So here are examples of student-focused interpretations. Ms. Malloy was an algebra teacher, and I was asking about one of the focal participants, and I said, why do you think he has trouble reading and understanding math and doing math? And she said, I think his biggest limitation is his attitude in the class. He does not want to be here. He's one of the most outspoken. I hate this class. I hate you, Ms. Malloy. So right away, it's like a problem of attitude. And then another algebra teacher said it's attendance. If students don't show up, they're not going to learn algebra. They're setting themselves up for huge gaps. So it's kind of attributing the challenge, or describing learning difficulties as student created. Other teachers made context-focused interpretations for challenge. Ms. Talbot, a U.S. history teacher, said, I would say, you know, when they have trouble reading or understanding in history, I would say social inequality mostly. Children from poverty tend not to do as well. Children of teen parents tend not to do as well. You look back from birth to 3 and making sure they're getting in contact with vocabulary acquisition and literacy, being read to. So she's kind of trying to think about their experiences before they even get to high school. And then Ms. Knox in reading gave another example of this context-focused interpretation, and she said she was working with a group of kids in the reading class on this English research paper they had to write. So they read all the stuff and write a research paper. And so she's working with them on it, devoting time in the supplementary reading class to it. And she said, and they worked so hard on these projects and they were so proud, and they turned them in and they all got Ds. And then they were all really upset. And as the interview went on, Ms. Talbot didn't say like they all got Ds because they did D work. She said, here I am, a reading teacher. I'm like ready to collaborate with the English teacher. So this is the problem of teacher collaboration. These kids shouldn't have had Ds. Like I could have known better what they needed to do. So again, it's like a context-focused interpretation. And that mattered for student-teacher interactions. That's where I'm going with it. So Mr. Robin, I was interviewing him about Keisha, and it's her history teacher. And I said, what would help her reading in history? And he said, I think there would have to be clear expectations of what appropriate behavior is in this class. She needs those boundaries. So it wasn't a response about instruction, it was a response about behavior. And this, if you've spent time in middle and high schools, happens all the time, where kids who are having trouble reading or having trouble like in a content area class are assumed to have like behavior problems. And so instead of instructional responses, there are like these behavioral responses about like managing checks and suspensions and stuff. Mr. Henry, on the other hand, who tended to take a more context-focused interpretation, said, you know, I think it's just having that consistent expectation, consistent behavior. She always knows how I'm going to treat her. So, right, he talks about behavior too. So I don't want to stand here and say that these students demonstrated totally like compliant, what you would expect to see in school kinds of behavior. These kids demonstrated a range of behaviors that you would maybe want to ask them to leave your room for. So that happened. But he's talking about his relationship with her. She knows how I'm going to treat her, and she did. And they had a positive relationship even when there were these blips on the screen. And then he went on to talk about something instructional. He said, in terms of mathematically speaking, you could just kind of give her a little bit of a nudge. Sometimes with her, I have to give her a separate example, and then she mirrors it. She has really improved. So teachers who were really context-focused in terms of understanding any literacy difficulty focused on instruction. They thought I could change instruction and I could help these young people read and write more effectively. For the sake of time, I'm gonna, so you can, I'm not gonna go through this whole slide in a detailed way, but you can imagine as Keisha, if she's in a room and the teacher is mainly focused on her behavior and telling her to put her cell phone away and telling her to like be quiet, and that's like the focus of the student-teacher interactions, it creates a really antagonistic kind of environment. And by the end of the year, she had just kind of stopped going to history because it was a difficult place both for the teacher and for the student. In classrooms where teachers focused on instruction, like in the algebra class with Mr. Henry, they managed cell phone problems. He says, like, I don't come in and out. I always try to be calm as I can. If you guys spent time in schools, right, like cell phones are like the devil. And teachers like, put your cell phone away. Like, it's such a thing. But in this case, like Mr. Henry could leverage his positive relationship with Keisha, deal with it, and get back to math. Teachers' interpretations of students' physiological states. So Keisha and all of the 7 other focal participants would come to school stressed out sometimes, like all 9th graders do. But we know that kids who are identified as struggling readers tend to be from like lower SES communities more often than not. And then there's stressors that come with that. So like a kid came and it was like the anniversary of the death of his baby brother, and he could not focus in school. Keisha came in, she was affiliated with a gang, and she was really stressed out and she felt like unsafe. And that day she couldn't focus in school. So there were all these different like physical, or I called them physiological stressors that didn't happen every day, but did happen over the course of a 9th grade year. And how teachers understood those moments of like distraction that the kids would have and how they handled it went a long way in positioning them as certain kinds of learners and certain kinds of readers. So in the case of Keisha, these are my field notes on the left. So this is from reading class. This is to teach 2 different interpretations of Keisha's behavior on the same day. I wrote, Keisha seemed very agitated and frustrated in class today. So I could tell she's kind of like jumpy, kind of like something was going on. And later, when I was talking to Ms. French, the reading teacher, about it, she described Keisha as possibly dangerous. Ms. French reported feeling hesitant to challenge or confront Keisha. Mr. Henry, and kind of looking back on that same day, we were talking about it, and he said to me, she is, from what I understand, a member of a gang. You know, I think there are just a lot of social pressure things at home. I think there's a lot going on there. And so I just think that she has a lot of social things that are competing against her being academic. 2 really different interpretations of the same kind of agitated, frustrated student. Ms. French kind of went to like, she's dangerous. And Mr. Henry said, from what I understand, she's affiliated with a gang. There's a lot competing with her attention, kind of like giving her the benefit of the doubt and recognizing she's got some social things on her plate that are going to make it hard to show up in math class or any class today. I want to leave enough time for questions. So classroom community and classroom climate was informed by these student-teacher interactions. As you might imagine, the more positive the student-teacher interactions, it wasn't just with the focal participants in my study, but it would kind of broaden out. And those classrooms tended to be kind of more positive social places to be. And that made a difference for how students interacted with texts and how they were as learners. And so I was curious about this by April. I'd been in the building all year, and I thought, you know, how do you create a classroom climate? And you do it through talk a lot of the time, through discourse. And so I looked at one day in April, I counted the number of what I called call-outs and compliments that teachers made during one class period. And these really representative class periods for these teachers. So a call-out, a compliment would be like, excellent, yeah, good connection, like just a public compliment to a student's thinking. And a call-out would be a public redirection, like, okay, just stop, pay attention. And I was curious of like how that would play out in terms of how I was experiencing these classroom climates. And you can see in Mr. Robbins' class, it's the pink row, that in the course of one class period, he made 12 call-outs, like redirecting behavior, put cell phones away, do this. And he issued 2 compliments, which were talking about students' thinking or their participation. In algebra, Mr. Henry's class, he had 5 times that he redirected a kid publicly, but 8 times he complimented their thinking and their work. And I think that this is a productive route for future research, looking at how students and teachers talk and then how they create classroom climates. And Mr. Henry's class was one in which Keisha showed up and she continued to interact in a positive way and improve her literacy skills. So as important as all of that social stuff, and I spent a lot of time on that because I think it's really important, because for 9th graders, for high school kids who are identified as struggling readers, they typically have been identified before they get to high school. So they don't always have really positive histories of participation with school. And so they come in and they're not used to having positive relationships with teachers. Maybe they have a couple like in their history, but they kind of already have their guard up. And so I think that when we talk about how do you best support struggling readers at the high school level, you have to think about the social dimensions and what the role of relationship and social context is in that. Equally important, however, was instruction. It wasn't just that like kids liked teachers who were nice. The classes that really engaged in disciplinary literacy instruction made a difference. It gave kids tools. It was like contextualized literacy instruction that helped them engage in a content area. And also in classrooms that had scaffolded instruction. So these kids did have some challenges that would manifest. So they needed different ways in. And so I saw that in those classrooms where there was really good disciplinary literacy instruction and it was scaffolded and it was at times it was explicit, it made a difference. It seemed to mediate their skills and their identities and their practices in positive ways. So instruction that was text-based, literacy skill building that was contextualized, disciplinary literacy instruction, as I've been saying, support for student engagement. These things all made a difference. So in the case of Keisha, In algebra class, Mr. Henry had an emphasis on mathematical literacy and talked to me about that. So he taught mathematical argumentation and how making an argument, defending your answer in math, was different from defending your answer in history. And that's a part of literacy. He taught translating across symbol systems. So you saw Keisha's work with exponents and having to translate it into English. So in math, part of disciplinary literacy is knowing there are multiple symbol systems at play in a math class, and that they represent, like in a linear function, you have a graph, you have an equation, you have a table, it represents the same linear function. And being explicit about that is a way to help young people engage in disciplinary literacy. And as a side note, I talk to teachers all the time, and when I talk to math teachers, and I'm like, I'm a literacy researcher, they're like, oh, good, because I need, like, what the assessments have become so verbal. I mean, so the written English is so intense. They're taxing complex assessments, and teachers, math teachers, want to know, like, how do I teach literacy in this discipline? You don't have to fight to get them talking about this. Conversely, Mr. Robbins' class, he also focused on reading like a historian, which is like, seems like a really good thing, but then students had a lot of difficulty understanding texts. There was a real emphasis on behaving and on compliance, as I talked about. And the instruction was mainly teacher-driven and a lot of lecture, where in the algebra class, it was a mix of lecture and student group work, and there was an emphasis on building mathematical identities, not just kind of getting classroom cooperation and compliance under control. So it was different approaches to literacy instruction in those two disciplines. And then it was scaffolded in different ways. And there were differentiated texts, for example, in algebra class. Like Mr. Henry would get his algebra worksheets out, and there would be a couple of versions, and you could pick which one, and the text demands of those worksheets would be different. So it gave kids options to make choices, and also different avenues into the learning of the day. Where in history, there were uniform texts. But both teachers were using texts, which is a really great thing, because when you study secondary literacy, you go into classrooms where there's no text at all, and the history teacher is just lecturing. So there are opportunities for kids to read and grapple with text, but there were more supports for making meaning with those texts in the algebra class. So I shared this at the very beginning of the talk, and this, I think, is an example of Keisha effectively translating across symbol systems. And she says, math's probably my favorite class. I can get my work done like a lot easier because Mr. Henry breaks it down. And I have so many quotes like this from different students where I say, I always ask, like, what's your favorite class? I'll ask at different times of the year, who's your favorite teacher? And inevitably, more often than not, they say something about the teacher's instruction. They don't say like, oh, Mr. Henry's great, he's so cool. They say like, oh, she's a really good teacher, or oh, he breaks it down. And I write about that in my work, and I talk about it because there is sometimes a misconception that kids who are identified as struggling learners don't care about learning, or they're work avoidant, or they're not identified with school. And over again, I don't see that play out in my data or in my studies. Kids want to be engaged in school, and they like teachers and they like classes because they learn in those classes. They don't say, oh, I like math because it's the easiest class, or like I said, he's really cool. They do say that. Like Keisha said to me once, we were talking about Mr. Henry, and she's like, I was like, what do you like about him? And she's talking about the class and how she's learning. And then she's like, and he's cool. He gets us and we get him. And it was like kind of great. You're like, she feels identified with this teacher who is holding her to like high academic standards and also to high like social standards. It's not a class where she can come in and just be on her phone all day, so that was important. Kids want those high expectations. So I found in this study, and continue to see, that the social and instructional dimensions of classroom context are fundamentally interrelated, that having good relationships enables teachers to engage. You guys get like helicopters at Rutgers? Oh, okay. It's never happened to me in the middle of a talk. They're fundamentally related. So good relationships enable teachers to take risks and like really go for it and like use rigorous instruction and have high expectations. And conversely, kids feel respected when they're asked to do really hard things, and when they're asked to engage in disciplinary thinking and disciplinary literacy, and that helps build the social relationship. And that to me is really interesting. And in a lot of literacy research, not all, but in some, there's such a focus on skills absent the social context. And I think that they work in tandem. And I think, and I don't work at the elementary level, but I always say, particularly at the secondary level, like it just seems so important for young people who may not have had positive or mainstream experiences in schools. So my final assertion is what I've been saying along the way. It's disciplinary literacy instruction, and it's trusting and caring relationships. And then kids are demonstrating proficient or improving reading skills. They're enacting identities. Mr. Henry talked about the fact that he views them as mathematicians. And they don't always just say, like, I'm a mathematician in algebra, but it's a different stance than I just want them to do really well on the end of your math assessment. Or I'm treating them like historians. I want them to read like historians. And it elevates, I think, the learning and teaching that happens. And also, and this is the first bullet actually is really important. In those classes, kids had positive feelings, expressed positive feelings about themselves, about their teachers, and their classes. And this, it's like a lot going on in your building. And that wasn't the case, right? At the end of the year, 4 of the 8 vocal participants are not coming to 9th grade. And that's a really big problem. And part of that had to do, I think, not with them always opting out, but feeling like positioned in ways that were so like kind of deficit framed and not enjoyable that they opted out of school. And so the relationship between like school positioning and young people's experiences, we need to really consider that when we're thinking about who stays in school, who does well, and why. So I'll end talking about this study with Mr. Henry's quote. And he kind of nailed this, and he says, I think if there's trust and genuine care both ways, that they try harder, that they're more engaged. And he said, I've built that trust that I don't waste their time. And in the middle of that quote, he's talking about he had to ask them to do something really rote because they just had to like learn, they had to memorize this thing so they could get onto the deeper concept. And he said, trust me, can you guys just do this? You need to know this so we can get to that. And they did it. And it's because he had the relationship with them that he doesn't waste their time. He doesn't ask them to do things that aren't meaningful. And this matters because of things like this. This reading teacher was telling me that she said to a student, you're really smart. And the student said, you're like the only teacher here that thinks that. So these are the experiences that a lot of kids identified as struggling readers have. One kid, the teacher also said, one of my kids in 5th hour wrote on her literacy history that it made her feel like less of a person when she can't read the words in class. And I thought it wasn't having trouble reading that made people feel bad when I talked to kids. It was how any kind of challenge or difficulty might be framed in the classroom, how it was understood in the context of the class or of the school that could position kids in negative ways. But the conclusion is that it is totally possible in a highly tracked school, when kids are coming in with these histories of struggling reader identification, to create classrooms where they engage, where they come to school, where they tackle complex texts, where they are better comprehenders, where they contribute to class discussions. That's all very possible and not easy to do, but possible. And that's one of the big takeaways from this study. I think the implications for schools from this study is that secondary schools can re-examine struggling reader identification processes and labeling practices. Like, how well is that working, and who's it serving? I think that a reorganization of secondary school literacy intervention programs needs some attention, and then the subsequent de facto tracking that happens. I didn't talk about this very much today because it's more on the institutional side, but what happens when you have an intervention class and all the kids are in it, and then they go to science and then they go to math? They're not in math intervention or science intervention, but those classes become the de facto low track classes for math and science. And those teachers are like, man, my 6th period history class is so hard, because they're now clustered based on their intervention classes. So it's really, it creates challenging things for both teachers and students to overcome. So I think, why don't we re-examine our secondary literacy intervention and the way we organize it? I think that schools could devote time and resources to disciplinary literacy instruction and learning, and think about optimizing learning contexts. And so for teacher education, I think it has to do with helping teachers enact disciplinary literacy instruction through trusting relationships, helping teachers examine assumptions they might have about reading and writing struggle, and help them build contextualized understandings of proficiency and difficulty. And we can do that in teacher prep and in professional development. And then talking to teachers, engaging them in how to construct equitable literacy learning contexts across like a classroom, across a school, and across a district. Teachers play a pivotal role in that, and we can invite them into discussions about how to create equitable literacy contexts. And then the implications for research, for me, coming off this study, were how do young people from different groups participate in and construct school literacy contexts? So what about readers with proficient labels or advanced labels? What about learners of varying SES backgrounds or different racial and ethnic self-identifications? How can promising literacy contexts not be like an isolated thing happening in like one history class, but how can we foster those and create and maintain those across the school building so that it happens? How do teachers share that information and construct those kinds of contexts, or across schools or across districts? And then what makes a context promising? This is what I found in this school, a really deep qualitative study with 8 students, but to what extent is it different for different students in different schools, different regions? And that needs more investigation. In literacy research, most people say, yeah, context matters. And there's a piece from like 1998 that Leslie Rex wrote, and I think it was in the Journal of Literacy Research. And she said, and this is a long time ago now, 1998, and she's like, you're hard pressed to find a literacy researcher that won't say context matters, but there hasn't been a lot of deep theoretical consideration of like, well, what is a context? Why and how does it matter? And so we still need more work on that. And so I took those questions, and that's kind of fueled my my subsequent studies. In 2015, I did a study of tracked English language arts contexts. I spoke briefly about that at the beginning, and I was really interested in this notion of reading proficiency and this notion of reading difficulty. And I had spent so much time focused on young people who are identified as struggling, and I thought, what would it be to like be in like an AP or an IB class and think about, what does good reading look like there? So I went across tracked classes and found that it was really quite contextualized. It wasn't really common across classes. And there are different ideas about what counted as reading proficiency and reading struggle then mediated the kind of teaching and learning that would happen in those classes. And now I'm in the middle of my next study, and I talked about it at the very beginning. Youth readers with these different reading labels across content area classes. It's like this monster study. I've got 15 focal participants, 5 in like remedial English, that's where I meant them, 5 in like the mainstream English, and 5 in AP. And I'm shadowing them to history and to science classes, doing a lot of the same interviewing and observation work. And then this is going to be a mixed method study where I am working with an educational sociologist to develop a survey, and I get to survey the whole 11th grade, and these are 11th grade, my focal participants, and ask them about their literacy experiences and how they understand proficiency and difficulty. And so the thrust of the study is very qualitative, but the fact that I get to add this survey piece in and get access to this whole 11th grade class will let me know to what extent does my focal sample reflect the 11th grade. And then survey data just tells you all kinds of things that qualitative data doesn't. And so I'm really curious to see what the different patterns and responses are across the 11th grade class. And with the survey, we'll ask them about their reading and literacy experiences in English, but also in science and history and across their classes. And so this has been a great study. Rosemary mentioned that Spencer is funding it, so it's like blowing my mind what I can do and all like the support that I have, and it's been fantastic. And I'm excited to get back and wrap up data collection through the end of the year. So thank you very much for your time, and we have maybe 20 minutes, and I'm curious about your questions, and I'm here. Yes.
I have like a few things. So when we had like Deborah Ball came here in the fall.
Oh, wonderful.
So you may have interacted with her in Michigan, but
yeah.
Something reminds me about this and like how teachers interpret, how they choose to interpret the way students respond in class, and like they can make different interpretations. And so I guess I'm coming to these ideas about like the questions about teacher education. I'm actually not involved in teacher education, so these might be naive questions. But one is like this idea that I don't know that teacher education is explicitly helping teachers develop relationships and like with students. So they're helping them with instruction, but there's nothing about. I mean, we might have talked about it as classroom management before, but maybe there's another way to think of it. But then this kind of I'm sorry, there's a lot here, but
No.
this other thing is, when I was a student teacher, we did this shadowing exercise where you follow the student around, and you got to see them outside of the one class. And I just wondered if that's common practice. I don't know if that's common practice, but if you saw your research method as a way for teachers to imagine their students in different ways, so like interpret them in different ways. I don't know if you comment on that.
Yeah.
Idea.
Thank you. I'm supposed to repeat the question for
Okay,
the people
sorry.
listening. So I'm gonna repeat some of the big points, and if I miss something, then you.
Sure.
So one question is, does this research method involving shadowing kids across school spaces, would that be productive for teacher preparation as a way to see their multidimensionality and who they are across the day? And the other comment had to do with Deborah Ball, who I know from Michigan, and she's fantastic, and she was talking about how teachers can choose to make different interpretations of students. And so perhaps, like, what could teacher ed do to teach pre-service or practicing teachers to develop relationships with kids, and maybe shift the discussion from classroom management to how do we build relationships. And those are really great comments. And I think there's variability across teacher education programs with regard to how much focus there is on relationship building. I think that it's been left out of a lot of programs, and pre-service teachers are so anxious about, like, what am I going to do, and what am I going to teach, and how am I going to do that? But I don't know, because I'm not a teacher education person either, so I haven't surveyed the field. But I know, for example, since you brought up Deborah Ball, that at Michigan right now, Elizabeth Moji is the dean, and they are they're making a lot of changes to their teacher education program, and I think they're developing a much closer working relationship with Detroit. They're doing a lot more with, like, urban education there, and, like, getting teachers and administrators involved. And I think there's going to be a lot more of a focus on student identity and how do we build relationships. There's going to be a bigger focus on disciplinary literacy as well, which inherently kind of involves relationships. So I think it's really important. I think, and pre-service teachers are so nervous about classroom management, and I understand how terrifying that is. And but I think talking about building relationships and talking about instruction, like somebody told me when I was becoming a teacher, 80% of classroom management is good instruction. And, like, the part of me still thinks that's true, right? Like, if you're giving kids meaningful things to read and to learn, it can deal with a lot of the things that might come up if they're bored, silly, or they just don't think what they're doing matters. So I'm all for talking more about relationships and student identities and teacher prep and in professional development. And then I think this would be a great way to help teachers understand, to shadow kids, to see, like, what does their school day look like. And when I was co-teaching, I really was, like, the only adult in the building who saw young people at different phases of their day in these different disciplinary domains and different social arrangements. And it was mind-blowing, because I knew what kids were capable of doing, or how they could show up in a classroom where in another room they just, like, kicked out like that. And then that teacher, I understand, is frustrated with that student and thinks of that student as, like, they can't even stay in the classroom. I have to kick them out every day. And it's like, so I think giving adults, both pre-service teachers and ones in buildings, chances to get to know students, that's about the relationship, but also get to know them academically and see what their days are like, see who they are. I mean, I write about this too. I mean, it's not just content area that matters. Like, if you're teaching a really big class right before lunch in 9th grade, it is a really hard class to teach, because they are hungry and they've been, like, paying attention all morning. And so aspects of context matter. And if you're a new teacher and you realize, like, oh, maybe they're just so squirrely because they're really hungry and they can't wait for lunch, and then you don't take it personally, helping teachers think about context on multiple levels so that they don't feel like it's a personality battle or something. I think that we could go a long way to keep talking about that in teacher ed. Thank you. Other comments or questions?
I had a whole lot of questions, but I'll limit it to one. I'd like to know the demographics, the ethnicities of the teachers, and did that make a difference?
Yeah. all of the teachers in the study I just presented were white. And it was a medium-sized city in the Midwest, and nearly all of the teaching staff at the high school were white as well. I mean, all of our different identities, our gender identities, our racial and ethnic identities make a difference with how we interact in the world as teachers or as students. I didn't systematically investigate that in this study. And if you see the focal participant slide I put up, I had a tremendous amount of variability in kids' racial and ethnic self-identifications. So I'm sure that it mattered that all of the students were white, as much as it mattered that the students in my study were speaking other languages at home, and many of whom were young people of color. And there's a lot of people who are studying this, like using critical race theory as a really helpful theoretical framework to look at how racial and ethnic identifications mediate our learning and who we are when we come to school. And there's a big push in a lot of teacher education programs to recruit more teachers of color, and like how important that is, that our teachers aren't just middle-class white women, because then overwhelmingly those are the people who go into teaching, and many of them are really, really wonderful teachers. But what would it do? Like, I'm interested in institutional context, so not just looking at like the choices one person makes, but how choices are mediated by like the institution that you're in. So what would that do for like a school building or a district if the administrators and the teachers were just more diverse? Like just having different voices at the table, and how would that inform policies and approaches to instruction? So I know that is a lot of schools that are really actively trying to diversify productively their teacher education programs.
Another question is disciplinary literacy. Will you address that in terms of maybe teacher education?
Yeah, well, so if you're in literacy research, there's like a lot of debate about what's more productive, to think about content area literacy, or just good literacy is good literacy, or disciplinary literacy. And people have different opinions about even what those things are. And so I'm one of the people who think disciplinary literacy is a really productive route. And it's the idea that that literacy in a discipline isn't just what we read, but like how we think about what we read, how we write about what we read. And so, for example, like what counts as evidence if you're writing a historical analysis using primary sources, and what counts as evidence when you're writing up your lab report for science are different kinds of evidence. And there's a lot of talk about evidence in secondary schools. What counts as warrants or like a good argument, the way you build an argument is different when you're trying to say this poem in your English class means X. So how you even like make your argument is different in like from a literary criticism perspective than the argument you might make looking across primary sources and history and saying, I think this historical event was significant for X. So it kind of takes the discussion about how we read and write and thinks about what are the ways of arguing across the disciplines? When are they the same and when are they different? What counts as evidence? What are the dispositions that a historian has and a mathematician has? The really easy example I give is that when a historian reads a primary source, they right away ask who wrote it and when did they write it? Because that's really important for understanding it. And good history teachers teach kids that when you look at a primary source, you got to think who wrote it and when did they write it? In math, and mathematicians, they very rarely, that's not the first question, like who wrote it? Because math is like a remarkably like cumulative field. There aren't upsets in mathematics that like kind of redo how we know what we think about like geometry. Like the field builds on itself. It's less important who's writing it or who's interpreting it. So when you give kids math texts at secondary school, that's not something they have to do. So I think disciplinary literacy invites us to think about these different ways of not just reading and writing texts, but also different ways of constructing knowledge and how texts are a part of that, writing and producing text in the disciplines. And what this means for teacher education is like, so at Michigan, when I was there, they moved away from a content area literacy class. So in pre-service teacher education programs, there's typically a content area literacy class. And like your math folks and your science folks and your English folks and everybody comes and you talk about content area literacy. And that's great because you're talking to pre-service science teachers about like how literacy matters. Michigan reorganized it into in disciplinary literacy classes. So the math teachers went to their disciplinary literacy class And I taught it, and it was wild. Like, all these math teachers like came to their literacy class, and there were only math people in the room, and they first were like, what am I doing here? And what do you mean there's like mathematical literacy? And so helping them like peel away and like become more aware of how they just translate across symbol systems like it's nothing. Like, they're not even aware that they're doing these really complex things that then they have to go teach secondary students to do. And so then we had like the science literacy class, and we had English literacy. And it gave us a chance to really dig deep with the pre-service teachers into what are the disciplinary practices and the knowledge building practices that might be unique to your field. And then how would you teach those to students? So that's, you know, I don't study this, so I can't say like really what's working, what's not, but that to me seemed really productive. And I think that the math teachers who came out of that program thought about literacy in their classes in vastly different ways, you know, than they had when they had come into the teacher education program, and they attended to it in their teaching, which was really cool.
I think part of the problem with that is that people start using literacy in different ways, like saying information literacy,
Right. Yeah.
technological literacy, health literacy, and it's not meant to be the same as what you're talking about.
Yeah, when that gets contested in literacy research too, like what is literacy? And I, you know we're like in this multimodal age where the way that you interpret like a text on your iPhone or your laptop, it is multimodal, and the images and the visuals and the writing, like you have to interpret it all together. So I think that's a really important area for research. But I agree that literacy has come to mean like anything. Like, I'm grocery store literate, you know, I'm media literate. It just means you know how to do something. And if literacy is everything, if it just means like, I don't know, like knowledge or proficiency, then what is it anymore? So I tend, and this is not always like this is Julie learned. I tend to think of that literacy, if you're talking about it, I do think multimodal literacy is really important, but I think that literacy has to involve also the decoding of an encoded symbol system. So that's what makes literacy different from like language. Like we as human beings, we learn language just as babies. You don't get taught to speak. You can just learn it in the room. You actually have to learn an encoded symbol system, like musical notation, like the alphabet, because it's not, it's created by people. And so I think that adds layers of complexity for learners, because they have to be taught that encoded symbol system and then negotiate that. So when I think about literacy, it always has that component for me. And at the same time that we know there are these other aspects that are important to literacy, but I don't think literacy is just everything. In fact, I'm teaching a doctoral seminar right now, and we're like grappling with this question, and they're like, will you just tell me what literacy is so I can like think about it or research it? And I'm like, well, you got to come to it yourself. It's like, there are a lot of competing conceptions of it. So we're talking about the pros and cons of those different conceptions right now in my doctoral seminar.
Can I just ask, like, I feel like we've been talking around this, but this idea of this reading 180 course, or
Yeah.
whatever
Yeah.
the more general thing is, this sort of like a pull-out or a reading course. It feels like you're arguing against that, and so I just want to know, do you see advantages to that kind of intervention for struggling readers? Is there an appropriate way that something like that institutions could put in resources and use that in a more productive
Yeah.
way?
Well, as a careful scholar, I don't want to make any sweeping statements, but I think what it was intended to do because that's based on some reading research that was done, and then it became a commercial program. And what that program was meant to do I think it's been adopted and implemented in ways that they didn't intend. And I don't think it's helpful in a lot of situations. I think it leads to de facto tracking. Among my sample of kids who are all in Read 180 by definition, because they were the struggling readers, a lot of them were getting A's in Read 180, but then failing content area classes. And it wasn't helping them grapple with primary sources and history. It was so decontextualized. It was like units of study, and maybe it helped them with like assessment, where like a high stakes assessment where you get a passage and you have to like read it and then answer comprehension questions about it. But is that really like learning in the sciences? So I think, and then the social consequences of being scheduled in reading intervention at high school after you've been in it for and often the same program, because so many districts are strapped, particularly urban school districts, and so they offer the same because they have the materials. They sent their key teachers to the really expensive PD, so they're like in it. I think that at high school, and that's saying one of the implications for this study is to really think about how we could reorganize secondary literacy. And I think the role of pull-out intervention needs to be reconsidered. And by high school, people could disagree with this, but very few people have trouble decoding. You know, like they can decode, but it's about knowledge and it's about approaching text and it's about understanding that I think we could put those resources that we use on expensive intervention programs and put that into professional development so that disciplinary teachers, content area teachers can address those needs that exist, but in the context of a discipline rather than in a pull-out program. So I think that especially at the middle and high school level, we need to really reconsider it. Particularly when you see kids like getting A's and feeling like I'm doing great, like I'm reading so much better, I'm reading faster, like there's this emphasis on speed. But then I would sit down and do a reading, think aloud interview with them with like a text from their math class and a text from their history class. And they would really grapple with it. And it was like the things they were being taught in the Read 180 class were just not affecting the way they interacted with the disciplinary texts very much.
We're good.
Any other comments or questions? Okay,
Thank you.
thank you very much.
I'm walking to the corner.
Yeah, we'll talk.